He thought firing her would protect his reputation, but in that moment, he had already signed away his own future. The glass doors of Holloway Financial slid open with a quiet hum as employees moved in precise rhythms across the marble lobby, heels clicking in sharp echoes, voices low, controlled, practiced, everything about the place designed to signal power, order, and perfection. And in the center of it all stood Emily Carter, barely noticeable behind the reception desk, her soft gray cardigan blending into the neutral tones of the building, as if she had trained herself to disappear, to exist without disturbing the carefully curated image around her. And for months, that was exactly what she had done, until the moment everything broke. It started with a sound no one expected, not loud, not dramatic, just the dull collapse of a body meeting polished stone. A man in his late 60s folding to the floor near the entrance as his briefcase slipped from his hand, papers scattering like startled birds across the gleaming surface. And for a second, no one moved. Executives froze mid-step. Assistants glanced at each other. Security hesitated. Because in a place like this, action required permission, and permission required hierarchy. And hierarchy required someone else to go first. But Emily didn't wait. She was already moving before the silence even settled, stepping out from behind her desk, her voice steady but firm as she knelt beside the man, checking his pulse, calling out for someone to dial 911, her hands careful, deliberate, focused only on one thing, keeping him present, keeping him breathing, while around her the room shifted uneasily, whispers rising, phones subtly lifted, not to help, but to record, because even in crisis, appearances mattered here. "Ma'am, you need to step back," one security guard finally said, uncertain, glancing toward the elevators as if waiting for authority to descend. But Emily didn't look up, didn't break focus, didn't ask for permission to do what was right. And that was the moment Richard Holloway stepped into the lobby, his tailored navy suit immaculate, his expression already tightening as he took in the scene, not the man on the ground. Not the urgency in Emily's voice, but the disruption, the disorder, the crack in the flawless image he had spent years building. And as the ambulance siren approached from a distance, growing louder, slicing through the controlled quiet of the building, Richard's jaw set in a way that those who knew him recognized immediately. Not concern, not relief, but calculation, because in his world, every moment was a liability or an asset. And right now, all he saw was damage. The paramedics arrived, efficient and swift, taking over where Emily left off, lifting the man onto a stretcher, asking quick questions, none of which Richard answered, because he was no longer looking at the man who had just been carried out. He was looking at Emily, still kneeling on the marble floor, her hands faintly trembling now that the urgency had passed, her breathing uneven, her eyes still steady, and for a brief second, the entire lobby seemed to hold its breath, caught between what had just happened and what was about to come next. Richard Holloway did not raise his voice at first, and that was what made the air tighten even more, because everyone in that lobby knew his silence carried more weight than anger ever could. His polished shoes stepping across the marble floor with measured precision until he stopped just a few feet from Emily, his gaze dropping to where she was still kneeling, as if her presence on the ground itself was an offense. Something out of place in a space built on control, and when he finally spoke, his tone was calm, almost clinical, the kind of calm that stripped warmth from every word, asking her what exactly she thought she was doing, not out of curiosity, but as a demand for justification. And Emily slowly stood, brushing her hands against her skirt, her voice steady despite the eyes now fixed on her from every direction, explaining that the man had collapsed and needed immediate help. That there had been no time to wait, no time to ask, only time to act. But Richard's expression did not change, not even slightly, because in his mind, the situation had already been defined, not as an emergency, but as a failure, a breach, a disruption of order that reflected directly on him. He glanced briefly toward the glass doors where the ambulance had disappeared, then back at Emily, and in that brief movement, the decision had already been made. Because what mattered to him was not what she had done, but how it looked, how it would be perceived by clients, by partners, by anyone who believed that this building represented stability and control. And now, in his eyes, it had been compromised by a receptionist who had stepped out of line, and the fact that she had done it to save a life did not fit into the equation he trusted. "You left your post," he said, each word landing with deliberate weight, and there was a murmur through the room, subtle but present, because everyone understood what that meant in a place like this. It was not just a statement, it was a charge, and Emily met his gaze, not defiant, not pleading, simply grounded, repeating that someone needed help and she had responded, and for a fraction of a second, something flickered in the room, a quiet recognition from those watching that she had done what most of them had not, but it faded quickly under the pressure of Richard's presence, because authority had a way of rewriting truth when it spoke with enough certainty. He took another step closer, lowering his voice just enough that people leaned in to hear, which only made it echo louder in the silence, explaining that Holloway Financial operated on discipline, on protocol, on maintaining a certain standard that clients trusted, and what had just happened, what she had just done, had created a scene, a spectacle, something that would be talked about for all the wrong reasons, and as he spoke, a few employees nodded almost instinctively, not because they agreed, but because agreement felt safer than resistance, and Emily stood there, absorbing each word without interruption, her hands now still at her sides, her breathing controlled, as if she understood that this moment was no longer about explaining herself, it was about enduring what came next. Richard adjusted the cuff of his jacket, a small, precise movement that seemed almost ceremonial, then delivered the conclusion with the same measured tone, informing her that her actions demonstrated a lack of judgment, a disregard for company standards, and an inability to understand her role within the organization, and therefore, effective immediately, she was no longer employed there. And the words did not explode, they did not crash, they settled into the room like something heavy and final, and for a heartbeat, no one moved, no one spoke, because even those who believed she had done the right thing felt the weight of what had just been taken from her, and Emily did not argue, did not raise her voice, did not plead for reconsideration. She simply nodded once, a small, controlled acknowledgement, as if accepting something she had already known would happen the moment she chose to act. And when she reached up to remove the thin badge from her cardigan, the quiet click of it detaching seemed louder than anything else in the room. A simple sound marking the end of her place in a world that had never truly seen her to begin with. The badge rested in her palm for a moment longer than necessary, its smooth plastic surface still warm from where it had hung against her chest, and Emily Carter looked at it not as something valuable, but as something that had defined how others saw her, a small rectangle that decided whether she belonged inside those glass walls or outside them. And without a word, she placed it gently on the reception desk, not tossed, not slid, but set down with quiet care, as if even now she refused to let the moment become something ugly, and that choice, that restraint, only made the silence around her heavier. No one stepped forward, no one spoke her name. The same people who had walked past her every morning now avoided her eyes, their attention suddenly absorbed by phones, papers, anything that allowed them to pretend this was just another routine moment in a perfectly controlled day, and Richard Holloway had already turned away, his role in the scene finished in his mind, adjusting his jacket as he spoke in low tones to a senior manager about damage control, about messaging, about making sure nothing about this incident reached the wrong ears, because for him, the problem had been solved the second Emily was removed from it. But Emily did not rush. She did not flee the building as if she had been chased out. Instead, she moved at the same steady pace she always had, stepping away from the desk, her shoes making soft, measured sounds against the marble floor, each step carrying her past the same polished surfaces and reflective glass that had never quite reflected her back as someone who mattered. And as she walked, fragments of the last few minutes lingered in her mind, not the words Richard had used, but the image of the man on the floor, the faint pulse under her fingers, the moment his breathing steadied just enough to hold on, and she held on to that instead, because that was the only part of this that felt real. Near the entrance, she paused briefly, her hand brushing against the cool metal of the door handle, and for the first time since it had happened, her shoulders lowered slightly, the tension leaving in a slow, controlled breath, not relief, not regret, just a quiet acknowledgement that something had ended and something else, though still unclear, had begun, and outside, The city moved as it always did, cars passing, people crossing streets, life continuing without pause or recognition of what had just taken place inside those walls. Behind her, the lobby began to reset itself, employees returning to their positions, voices rising back to their usual measured tones, as if the entire event could be folded away and forgotten. But not everything disappears so easily, because in the hours that followed, small details started to surface, quiet conversations between managers, a call placed to confirm the identity of the man who had been taken away, a name spoken once, then repeated more carefully, Edward Grant, and the reaction to that name was not loud, not immediate, but it was unmistakable, a shift in posture, in tone, in urgency, because Edward Grant was not just another visitor. He was the investor, the one whose decision in less than 24 hours would determine whether Holloway Financial expanded into something greater or collapsed under the weight of its own ambitions. And suddenly, the scene from earlier no longer looked like a minor disruption. It looked like something else entirely, something far more dangerous, something that could not be undone by silence or spin. And yet, the one person who had been at the center of it, the one who had made the difference, was already gone, walking away from a building that had just made the most expensive mistake it did not yet understand. By the time the sun began to lower behind the glass towers of the city, the calm inside Holloway Financial had become something fragile, something carefully maintained rather than naturally restored, because the name Edward Grant had a way of moving through rooms without needing to be announced, and once it was spoken, even quietly, it carried weight that no one could ignore. And in the executive offices above the lobby, that weight was beginning to settle into something heavier than discomfort, something closer to realization. Richard Holloway stood at the head of a long conference table, his reflection stretching across its polished surface, listening as his senior team spoke in cautious tones, each sentence measured, each word chosen to avoid sounding like blame. But the tension beneath their voices was unmistakable, because they all understood what was at stake. And more importantly, what had already been done. Edward Grant was not simply a potential partner. He was the decision, the kind of investor who did not follow markets but shaped them, the kind of name that opened doors before meetings even began. And tomorrow morning, he was scheduled to walk into that very building to finalize a deal that would secure the company's future for years, a deal Richard had spent months negotiating, refining, protecting, and now, for the first time, there was a crack in that certainty. "We need to confirm his condition," one executive said carefully, glancing toward Richard, who remained still, his hands resting lightly on the table as if pressure alone could hold everything in place. And another added that the hospital had only released limited information, stable, conscious, under observation, nothing more, and yet even that was enough to shift the room, because stable meant aware, conscious meant remembering, and remembering meant that the events of the lobby were no longer contained within the building. They were now part of Edward Grant's perspective, his experience, his judgment. Richard finally spoke, his voice controlled, steady, insisting that the situation had been handled appropriately, that protocol had been followed, that the company had maintained order during an unexpected incident. And for a moment, no one challenged him directly, but the silence that followed was different now, not obedient, not automatic, but thoughtful, questioning. Because even those who respected him could feel the gap between what had happened and what he was describing, and in that gap, doubt began to grow. One of the younger analysts shifted in his seat before speaking more plainly than the others had dared, mentioning the receptionist, the one who had responded first, the one who had acted when no one else had, and how she had been removed immediately after, and the words hung there, not accusatory, but undeniable, and Richard's gaze sharpened slightly, as if the mention of her presence threatened to complicate something he had already decided was simple, dismissing it as irrelevant, as a personnel matter, as something already resolved. But the room did not move past it as easily as he did. Because in a world built on perception, on trust, on the quiet assumptions that guided decisions worth millions of dollars, actions mattered more than explanations. And somewhere across the city, in a hospital room surrounded by quiet machines and steady lights, Edward Grant was no longer just a name on a contract. He was a man with a memory, a man who had seen, who stepped forward and who stepped back, who acted and who hesitated, And while the executives in that room tried to calculate outcomes, to predict reactions, to manage risk, there was one variable they could not control: the simple, unfiltered truth of what had happened when no one thought it would matter. And as the meeting drew to a close, the realization settled in slowly, almost reluctantly, that tomorrow would not be just another negotiation. It would be a moment of judgment. And for the first time in a long time, Richard Holloway was not the one deciding how that judgment would fall. Morning arrived with a kind of brightness that felt almost indifferent to what had been set in motion the day before. Sunlight pouring through the towering glass walls of Holloway Financial, as if nothing inside had changed, and yet everything had, though not in ways that could be immediately seen, but in the subtle shifts of posture, in the quiet glances exchanged between employees, in the way conversations paused when certain names were mentioned. And at the center of it all was a single expectation that hung over the building like a quiet storm: Edward Grant would be arriving within the hour. Richard Holloway stood in his office overlooking the city, adjusting his tie with practiced precision, his reflection steady, controlled, unchanged, because for years he had built a career on remaining composed under pressure, on shaping outcomes before they could shape him. And even now, he told himself that this situation was no different, that whatever had happened in the lobby was a minor disruption, something that could be reframed, explained, managed, but beneath that surface certainty, something less comfortable had begun to settle, not fear exactly, but awareness, the kind that comes when control begins to feel less absolute than it once did. Downstairs, the lobby had been restored to perfection, every surface polished, every detail aligned, as if the previous day had never existed, and yet the memory of it lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed it, especially when the doors finally opened and a black car pulled up outside, its arrival quiet but immediately noticed, because even without introduction, presence like that announced itself. The doors parted, and Edward Grant stepped inside, his movements measured, his expression calm, but there was something in the way he paused just inside the entrance, something in the way his eyes moved across the lobby, not hurried, not distracted, but deliberate, as if he were not simply arriving for a meeting, but revisiting a moment, retracing something that had already happened. Conversations softened, footsteps slowed, and a subtle tension moved through the room as people recognized him, not from having met him before, but from knowing exactly who he was, the man whose decision would determine the future of the company they stood in. And for a brief moment, everything seemed to hold, waiting for the next movement, the next word, the next signal of how this day would unfold. Richard appeared at the top of the staircase, descending with controlled confidence, his posture perfect, his expression composed into something welcoming, extending his hand as he reached the lobby floor, greeting Edward with the polished tone of someone accustomed to closing deals, to guiding conversations, to leading outcomes toward his desired conclusion. And Edward accepted the gesture, his handshake firm but unreadable, his gaze steady, and for a moment, it seemed as though the previous day had been left behind, as though the meeting would proceed exactly as planned. But then Edward's eyes shifted, just slightly, moving past Richard, scanning the space behind the reception desk, the same space where a quiet figure had once stood, where a voice had spoken when others remained silent. And when he looked back, there was a pause, small but unmistakable, before he asked a single question, his tone even, almost casual, but carrying a weight that settled instantly into the room. "Where is the young woman who helped me yesterday?" And just like that, the carefully restored order fractured again, not visibly, not dramatically, but in the way the air changed, in the way Richard's expression held for a fraction too long, in the way no one immediately answered, because the truth was simple, undeniable, and impossible to reshape. And as that silence stretched, it became clear that this moment, not the contract, not the negotiation, was what would decide everything that came next. The question did not echo, yet it seemed to reach every corner of the room, settling into the polished surfaces, into the stillness of those standing nearby, into the careful posture Richard Holloway had maintained until that exact moment. And for the first time, his control hesitated, not visibly to most, but enough for those closest to notice the slight delay before he responded. The fraction of a second where calculation replaced confidence, because this was not a question he had prepared for, not one that could be answered with polished language or redirected with practiced ease. "She is no longer with the company," Richard said finally, his tone even, controlled, as if the matter were administrative, insignificant, already resolved. But the words did not carry the weight he intended, because they did not match the importance of the man standing in front of him, and Edward Grant did not respond immediately, his gaze steady, searching Richard's face not for explanation, but for truth. And when he spoke again, his voice remained calm, but there was a clarity to it now, a precision that made every word land exactly where it needed to. Asking why someone who had stepped forward when others did not would no longer be part of an organization that claimed to value leadership and responsibility. The room held its breath, not out of shock, but out of recognition, because this was no longer a conversation about a receptionist. It was a reflection of something larger, something foundational, and Richard felt it, even as he attempted to maintain his position, explaining that procedures had been broken, that roles had been disregarded, that in a structured environment, actions must align with expectations. But even as he spoke, the explanation sounded thinner than it had the day before, less convincing under the weight of a different perspective, and Edward listened without interruption, without reaction, until the final words settled. And then, slowly, he shook his head, not in anger, not in disbelief, but in quiet understanding, the kind that comes when something becomes clear, beyond argument. He glanced briefly around the lobby, at the employees standing still, at the reception desk now occupied by someone else, at the space where a decision had already been made before it was fully understood, and when he looked back at Richard, the shift was undeniable, not louder, not harsher, but final. He spoke about trust, about how it is not built in conference rooms or contracts, but in moments when no one is watching, when decisions are made without certainty of reward, and how the actions of an organization in those moments reveal more than any presentation ever could. And as he spoke, the meaning settled into the room with a weight no one could ignore, because everyone there had been present, everyone had seen what happened, everyone had chosen their role in that silence. Richard attempted to respond, to redirect, to reframe the situation into something manageable, but the space for that had already passed, because this was no longer about explanation, it was about consequence. And Edward made that clear without raising his voice, without needing to emphasize a single word, stating simply that any partnership built on values must reflect those values consistently. And what he had witnessed did not align with the kind of organization he intended to support. The impact of those words did not arrive all at once. It spread slowly, like a realization moving through the room, through the executives who understood what this meant for their plans, for their projections, for everything that had been built around this agreement. And Richard stood there, still composed on the surface, but beneath that, something had shifted irreversibly, because for the first time, he was no longer directing the outcome. He was standing inside it, and there was nothing he could do to change the direction it had already begun to take. The silence did not break with noise. It deepened, stretching across the lobby until even the smallest movement seemed out of place. And Edward Grant did not raise his voice, did not repeat himself, did not demand anything further, because he did not need to. The weight of what he had already said was enough, and with a slow, deliberate motion, he withdrew his hand from the briefcase he had been holding, setting it down beside him as if the purpose he had come for no longer required it. And that single gesture carried more meaning than any formal statement could have, because everyone in that room understood what it represented. Richard Holloway felt it immediately, not as a sudden collapse, but as something more unsettling, the quiet realization that control had shifted completely out of his reach, and for a moment, he attempted to recover it, offering to clarify, to revisit the situation, to ensure that any misunderstanding could be addressed properly, his words precise, practiced, but lacking the certainty they once held. And Edward listened just long enough to let the effort exist before gently cutting through it. Not with confrontation, but with finality, explaining that there was no misunderstanding, that what he had witnessed was clear, and clarity did not require negotiation. Around them, executives stood still, their earlier confidence replaced by something more cautious, more aware, because the deal they had built projections around, the expansion they had already begun to imagine, was no longer unfolding as expected, It was dissolving quietly in front of them, not with anger, not with spectacle, but with calm decision, and that made it impossible to challenge. Edward spoke again, this time not only to Richard, but to the room itself, saying that an organization reveals its priorities not in prepared statements, but in unplanned moments, and that the person who had acted without hesitation had demonstrated more leadership in a few seconds than many did in years, and removing that person had not protected the company, it had exposed it. And as those words settled, they did not accuse, they did not attack, but they left no space for defense, because everyone present had seen the truth of them. Richard's posture remained upright, his expression controlled, but the space around him had changed. The authority that once filled it now felt thinner, less certain, and for the first time, the room was not following his lead. It was watching him, waiting, not for direction, but for acknowledgement, and that difference was unmistakable. Edward reached for his briefcase again, closing it with a soft click that echoed more than it should have in the stillness, then stepped back slightly, not in retreat, but in completion, as if the decision had already been made long before he arrived, and this moment had simply confirmed it. And when he spoke next, it was with a quiet clarity that left no ambiguity, stating that he would not be moving forward with any agreement, not because of numbers, not because of strategy, but because of what he had learned about how this company chose to act when it mattered most. No one interrupted, no one attempted to persuade him otherwise, because persuasion required leverage, and in that moment, there was none left, only consequence. The lobby, so carefully restored to perfection, now held a different kind of stillness, one that could not be polished away, and as Edward turned toward the exit, the path in front of him opened without instruction, employees stepping aside instinctively, not out of fear, but out of recognition, because something fundamental had just shifted, and when the glass doors closed behind him, the quiet that remained was no longer controlled. It was heavy, undeniable, and for Richard Holloway, standing at the center of it, it marked the beginning of a reality he could no longer shape, only face. The doors had barely settled back into place before the weight of what had just happened began to ripple outward, not in loud reactions, but in quiet, irreversible shifts, executives exchanging looks that no longer needed words, assistants lowering their voices, conversations breaking apart before they could fully form, because everyone understood that something far more serious than a lost deal had just occurred, something that would not stay contained within the walls of the building. And at the center of it all stood Richard Holloway, still in the same position, still composed on the surface, but now surrounded by a silence that no longer belonged to him. He did not move immediately, as if motion itself required a level of certainty he no longer possessed, his eyes fixed ahead, not on any one person, but on the space Edward had just left behind, a space that now felt like a line dividing everything that had come before from everything that would follow. And for the first time in years, Richard was not calculating his next move. He was absorbing the consequences of the last one. A senior partner stepped forward cautiously, his voice low, measured, speaking not to challenge, but to confirm what they all already knew, that the agreement was gone, that the projections built around it were now meaningless, that the expansion plan would collapse without immediate alternatives. And even as he spoke, others began to shift, not away from Richard physically, but away from the authority he had represented, their posture changing, their attention no longer anchored to him as it had always been, and that subtle change carried more weight than any confrontation ever could. Upstairs, phones began to ring, messages arriving from board members, from stakeholders who had already heard fragments of what had happened, because information like this did not stay quiet for long, not when it involved a name like Edward Grant, and within minutes, what had been a private moment in a lobby became a question circulating at levels Richard could not control, not with explanations, not with carefully chosen words, because the story itself was too simple, too clear, too aligned with something people understood instinctively. Someone had done the right thing, and that person had been removed for it. Richard finally exhaled, a slow, controlled release that seemed to carry more than just breath, and he turned slightly, as if expecting the structure around him to remain unchanged, but it did not respond the same way it once had, because authority is not held by position alone, it is sustained by belief, and in that moment, belief had begun to fracture. He issued instructions, concise, efficient, directing teams to stabilize communication, to prepare statements, to minimize impact, and people moved, but not with the same certainty, not with the same alignment, because the foundation beneath those instructions no longer felt solid, and that difference, subtle as it was, marked the beginning of something he could not easily reverse. Outside, the city continued without pause, traffic moving, people walking, unaware that inside one building, a decision made in less than a minute had just rewritten the trajectory of an entire company. And somewhere across that same city, Emily Carter moved through her day without knowing any of it, without knowing that the moment she had chosen compassion over protocol had set something much larger into motion, something that would soon find its way back to her, not with noise, not with spectacle, but with the quiet, undeniable weight of truth returning to its source. And inside Holloway Financial, as the tension settled into something more permanent, one realization began to take shape, slow, clear, and impossible to ignore, that the most critical decision of the day had not been made in the conference room, but on the marble floor of the lobby, by someone who no longer worked there. The days that followed did not unravel all at once, but they did not heal either. They settled into the company like a quiet fracture that no amount of polish could conceal. Board members began asking questions that could not be answered with rehearsed statements. Partners delayed conversations that had once seemed inevitable, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the confidence that had defined Holloway Financial began to thin, not because of a single decision, but because of what that decision revealed about the foundation beneath it. And at the center of it all, Richard Holloway remained outwardly composed, continuing to arrive each morning in the same tailored suits, issuing the same precise instructions, maintaining the same tone of authority, but something had changed in the way those instructions were received. The immediate alignment, the unquestioned trust, it had been replaced by something more cautious, more measured, as if those around him were no longer following, but observing. Across the city, far removed from conference rooms and quiet power shifts, Emily Carter sat in a small cafe near a bus stop, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of coffee she had barely touched, the events of the previous day already settling into memory not as regret, but as something more complex, something quieter, because while she had lost something tangible, something immediate, she had not lost the certainty of why she had acted, and that certainty sat with her now, steady, unshaken, even as the future in front of her remained unclear. She had not checked her phone much, had not searched for updates, had not tried to understand what might be unfolding back at the building, because she had already accepted that whatever came next would not be shaped by what she said or explained. It would be shaped by what had already been done, and in that acceptance, there was a kind of calm that did not need validation. It was later that afternoon when her phone finally rang, a number she did not recognize, and for a brief moment she considered letting it pass. But something in the persistence of it made her answer, her voice quiet, cautious, as she introduced herself, and on the other end, there was a pause, not uncertain, but deliberate, followed by a voice she recognized immediately, steady, composed, unmistakable, Edward Grant. He did not speak in long sentences, did not offer explanations or formalities. He simply acknowledged what she had done, not as something extraordinary, but as something essential, something that should have been obvious but had not been, and he told her that he had asked for her name, that he had taken the time to understand what had happened after he was taken away, and that what he had learned had confirmed something he valued deeply. That character reveals itself when no one is instructing it to act. Emily listened, not interrupting, not reacting outwardly, but the weight of his words settled quietly, because this was not recognition she had expected, not something she had acted to receive, and yet it arrived with a sincerity that made it impossible to dismiss. He did not offer her the job she had lost, did not suggest returning her to the place that had removed her. Instead, he offered something different, an opportunity built on trust rather than position, asking if she would consider working with a foundation he supported, one focused on community outreach and emergency response training, a place where the instinct she had shown would not be seen as disruption, but as value. And for a moment, the noise of the cafe faded, the uncertainty of the past. Days shifting into something else, something that felt less like loss and more like redirection. Emily closed her eyes briefly, taking in a slow breath, and when she answered, her voice remained as steady as it had been in the lobby, not overwhelmed, not hesitant, simply certain, because she understood something now that did not need to be explained, that the path she had been removed from was not the one she was meant to stay on, and as she thanked him, not for the offer, but for the recognition of something deeper, the conversation ended as quietly as it had begun. And in a city that never paused, where buildings rose and fell on decisions made in rooms most people never saw, there remained a truth that did not depend on titles or authority, that in the moment when it mattered most, one person had chosen to act, and that choice, simple and unannounced, had rewritten far more than anyone in that marble lobby had understood, because in the end, respect was never decided by position. It was revealed by character, and that day, without raising her voice, without asking for anything in return, Emily Carter had shown exactly what that looked like.